So really like knows everything and was involved in all kinds of things from the very beginning.
It comes from.
I don't know how well the sound's coming through though.
It's in better context and we don't want to use it. It's like.
I'll stand up there and talk.
Well, let's do
What's
something.
the word, the content, it doesn't match the
I can
best.
no, I can't turn it on because
So
it's
graphs, and so figure out how
Don't
to
worry.
deal with that.
I think it's gonna work fine.
Anyways, there's like one question I think about, you know, what we're leveraging in industry, and I think it's a pretty good mix, but there are different.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're very excited today to have the team partners from BioFund in Mozambique here. And I want to thank WWF for hosting this event and on behalf of the CFA and partners. And we're really excited to hear a presentation that's entitled something about the future of finance or something quite big, right? What was it?
It's behind you.
Oh, it's behind me? Oh, no, that's okay. So it was proposed as that, but we're going to hear Sean Nazerali talk about environmental funds and NPAs in a changing world. And BioFund has really been a very interesting, relatively new trust fund on the scene, and the success that you've had so far has been really impressive, and we're really hoping that it continues because the need is so great and the opportunities so large as well. So just to let everyone know online and here who we have with us here, we have Louis Honwana, who's the executive director of BioFund, and thanks very much for coming, as well as Anabela Rodrigues, who's WWF country director, as well as sits on the board of BioFund, and Sean Nazerali, who is innovative finance specialist with BioFund as well. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Sean up to present, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussions afterwards.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks very much, WWF, for inviting us to come and present a little bit about what it is we're doing and some of our ideas for the future. And we'd be very interested in getting your feedback on all of that. So first, a little bit, who are we? For those of you not familiar with Mozambique, this is where we are in Southern Africa. We are an independent Mozambican foundation. There is no such thing as a trust fund under Mozambican law, and so we are incorporated as a foundation. We were created in 2011, and then we officially launched the foundation in 2015 once we had got all the paperwork and the various pieces of administrative bureaucracy in place. We're a little bit different than many trust funds in that we have members, and BioFund has 52 or 53 members in our organization, and these include both individuals who are from many different areas of life, not just conservationists, but also key institutions, and almost all the organizations that work with or in conservation and in protected areas in Mozambique are members of BioFund, which gives us a big constituency as well. Our mission is focused on the sustainable finance of biodiversity conservation, with a special focus on protected areas, but not exclusively so. We work, and the way we organize our work is in 3 strategic pillars. The first, we are still a young organization, and so our first pillar is to consolidate ourselves as an institution to make sure we're able to carry out our work. Our second pillar is our core business, or financing conservation. But over time, we've realized that we need to put additional work around that core business. And therefore, we have a third strategic pillar, which is about creating an enabling environment for conservation within the country. So in terms of our consolidation, we are increasing our staff, we're developing endowment funds. Increasingly, we're being used as a financial channel for disbursement and working on innovative finance solutions. So we're growing quite quickly. In the last 3 years, we've almost tripled in size. Our endowment has grown from 0 in 2013 to $35 million as we speak. Most of this money has come from the German cooperation through KfW, but also with contributions from the GEF, from Conservation International. For dispersing other projects or directly to the protected areas, as a result of our ability to get money out to the protected areas and empower them to spend it, we've been chosen increasingly as a channel for other people's funds as well, French, the World Bank, and most recently the European Union, and we've now raised nearly $21 million to also get out to the protected areas over the next couple of years. This is on top of the funding that comes from our endowment. So, number of partners involved has also been growing over the years. In terms of direct implementation, we're now beginning to implement projects directly as well, and that's also come very rapidly along and has tripled in size just over the last year. This is working on ourselves, but also particularly education and conservation, a little bit of applied research we're beginning with the European Union and our Biodiversity Offsets program. In terms of innovative financing, our biggest single program on this is on biodiversity offsets, which we see as a way to harmonize the economic development of the country with the needs for biodiversity conservation. Looking at a way to merge these two very disparate goals. The drivers in Mozambique, you can see there are massive investments in mining and natural gas. All of these little blue squares here and pink ones are mining concessions in Mozambique. So well over half the country is covered in mining concessions. We have, however, quite ambitious targets under our National Biodiversity Action Plan. At the same time, we have a private sector that's increasingly being confronted with international norms around biodiversity conservation. The IFC principles, the World Bank has updated its standards, the Equator Bank funding. All these are driving people to look more at their biodiversity requirements. So in 2015-16, Mozambique developed a roadmap on how to deal with biodiversity offsets, published with support from the World Bank in 2016. And then this got the attention of the government, and the government actually included it in its update of environmental impact assessment legislation in 2015. So we now actually have quite a decent regulatory environment for this. So biodiversity offsets are an area that is growing. At this point in time, we have a great deal of interest from a number of major private sector investments, and we're beginning to implement some pilot projects this year. Innovative financing, we're also looking at some cooperation with the private sector, with one of the first affinity debit cards in Mozambique. It's actually a biodegradable card as well. It's made out of the residues of maize. And we're looking to work with our national power company, the electricity company of Mozambique, on how we can limit sedimentation from deforestation along riverbanks and how that might impact and improve their power production. And therefore, they may be interested in paying for those activities. So we're looking into how that can be done. When we look now at our main pillars, our financing conservation, we are expanded. We're now moved throughout the country. We have 13 beneficiaries and in 20 specific projects around the whole country. And in the last 2.5 years, we've dispersed nearly $3.5 million. So both marine and terrestrial, as of 2019, we're now working in all marine protected areas in Mozambique. But like I said, we need to think a little bit about the environment and the context in which we work. And it's important to consider that money alone is not enough. But if we don't have the society with us, then we won't be able to achieve those goals. So we've been working on environmental education and knowledge sharing. We're just beginning a new program on training and leadership. And of course, partnership and advocacy at the government level. These we can see in our annual biodiversity exhibition, which is now moving around the country each year. It goes to a different province to increase awareness of biodiversity. Knowledge sharing through the virtual library that's online, has some 2,000 documents on biodiversity in Mozambique, now freely available for everyone. And doing advocacy for conservation on a number of different topics. Probably the most important issue has been that of co-management and the role of co-management in improving protected area management in Mozambique. BIOFUND, together with the funding from USAID, brought in some consultants and developed a strategy for improving conservation management and did a great deal of analysis on the different results being made by collaborative management partnerships across the country and in the greater region of Southern Africa, as a result of which the government has adopted co-management as their preferred approach for managing protected areas in the country. Our conservation leadership program, is a new initiative started up with support from the World Bank, looking at improving the capacity of professionals working inside the national conservation system, trying to motivate young conservationists and young students to come out into the protected areas, learn about what it's really like in the bush, and also to bring new intellectual capacity to those protected areas, and attracting the local students into that network, hopefully creating the conservationists of the future. This dovetails with some of the work that large international organizations are doing, which are bringing out of places like Mozambique, bringing them here for full master's programs as well as short courses. So this provides also a portal to get to Mozambican students for some of the work that WWF is doing in education. I was asked to speak a little bit about marine protected areas, so I thought we'd talk a little bit about mangroves. And mangroves, one of our folks talked about this year as some of the most climate resilient and productive ecosystems on the planet. In Mozambique, we have the 13th largest mangrove cover in the world. It's about second or third largest mangrove quantity in Africa. And 7 of our conservation areas have mangrove forests in greater or lesser extent. In Mozambique, we see mangroves supporting the livelihoods of more than 60% of the population, which lives along the coastal areas, and are being strongly impacted by development. So BIOFUND is now working in 2018, we were working in 57% of the areas that had the mangrove forest and protecting about 20,000 hectares, and just over $2/3 million got money to conservation areas that have mangroves. In 2019, we're now supporting all of the conservation areas that have mangrove forests, up over slightly over 110,000 hectares, and more than $1 million is going to conservation areas with mangrove forests. However, always a good thing to do is to ask is whether or not are we actually doing a good job. We can talk a lot about we've been in a lot of places, but are we doing a good job of it? And this is where things like the CFA come in. So for those of you not familiar with the CFA, the Conservation Finance Alliance is sort of an overarching entity for many of the conservation trust funds and other finance initiatives. So within the world, there's a number of these regional linkages of conservation trust funds. REDLAC is the largest and most established of those for Latin American and Caribbean funds. We're members of CAFE, which is the Consortium of African Funds for the Environment. We actually a founding member of CAFE. CAFE was being founded just about the same time as BioFUND. So BioFUND participated both as a founding and being founded member, and a number of you were present in some of those discussions. So what CFA has done is recently, a few years ago now, they put together what they call the practice standards for conservation trust funds. And it provides a set of 6 core areas that are analyzed and have standards of what kind of performance and activities should a trust fund do. And this is an excellent framework to reflect on where we are and how far we've come. And so at the beginning of this year, we conducted an external assessment of the institution. We contracted Kathy McKeedon, who together with Barry, one of the people who wrote the first set of standards, and so was uniquely qualified to come and do an assessment of the institution. And we found, Kathy found, that of the 85 criteria in those 6 standards, BioFUND is meeting or exceeding it, nearly over 83 of them. So we found this was a very useful exercise because it also managed to highlight some of the key areas that we still need to focus on. And these were the 3 major areas: the need to revise BioFUND's founding documents, to update them, as well as the fact that the legal context in which we're operating, Mozambique, has recently passed a new law on foundations. We had an urgent need to focus on our investment oversight. We now have $35 million. When we first wrote our investment policy, we had 0 in the endowment. We weren't even sure we had an endowment promise. Our first promises never came through for our endowment anyway. So we had an investment policy. It was a paper document. And unfortunately, it sort of stayed that way, even though we've now grown our endowment. And so it was recognized that we really needed to put a lot more attention on that. And so this year we've worked quite hard on trying to update that policy, reanimate our investment committee, and review our investment manager's performance as well. And a strategic need to work out and improve our relationships on a strategic level with the National Agency for Protected Areas within Mozambique. So another area of focus for us. So I think when we reflect on the use of these practice standards and their usefulness for other institutions, we thought it was an incredibly useful exercise to bring in and sit down and have a set of standards to review the organization's process. There's a definite advantage to bringing in specialized expertise to do this. And I would recommend those other funds who are thinking of this to do this with a facilitator. It would actually be a very good tool to use before a strategic planning exercise. We did it the other way around. We redid our strategic plan last year, and then we did the assessment this year. And actually, it probably would have been much better if we'd done it the other way around. It would have maybe influenced some of the things we put in our strategic planning document for the next 5 years. And we found it was particularly helpful to have a tailored tool that is specifically geared to our reality, because conservation trust funds are a very strange animal in most cases. And we don't have a lot of peers. We don't have a lot of organizations that do exactly what we do. So having a specialized instrument for it was useful. And there was significant added value to having it given the seal of approval, as it were, by the CFA. I say this because we have an in-house effectiveness tool that we developed 5 or 6 years ago on management effectiveness for us as BioFUND. And every single time we stick it up on the screen and say, according to BioFUND's management effectiveness tool, our effectiveness has grown from X% to wherever we are now, 77 or 78%. Everyone always says, but what is this tool and why is it? And you're just taking it. What does this mean anyway? Since doing this assessment with the CFA tool, not once has that been questioned. So I think that also speaks for CFA's reputation as well around the world. So maybe there's a need to add some aspects. We know the practice standards are about to be reviewed. There's already a team hired, and if I'm not mistaken, I'm speaking with them on Tuesday. But we think there might be some need to add some new aspects. One of those is the issue of enabling environment, because we increasingly recognize that we don't work in isolation, and we can be a very good institution, but we need to have the context to be favorable. And the second area we think that there might be useful guidance on is on social safeguards. It's something that is increasingly important, social environmental safeguards, or social environmental policies, at least for environmental funds. It's something we're being asked to look into ourselves, and we'd love to have some guidance from you, David, on how to do that well. Because in the end, money is not everything, not even for an environmental fund. So thanks very much for your attention. And Louise, Anabela, and myself are here for today. We're going to Red Lac tomorrow, and we'd love to listen to any questions you might have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sean.
It's about on time.
That was perfect. Yeah. So great. So we have about a half an hour for questions, and I'm sure that the audience here has a few. First, I just want to say that from our perspective, the breadth of activities and the role that BioFund is playing in the conservation environment in Mozambique is very impressive. And so from a model, we see conservation trust funds taking more and more of a role in innovative finance and pushing the agenda of conservation in the countries where they work. They're, as much as they're important as a source of finance, they're really important as institutions, having a voice and a seat at the table. And your suggestion and work on the enabling environment follows along from that that evolution of trust funds. So that's a very interesting point, and I want to commend you for the work that you've been doing and the success that you're having in this space. So much more to do, but so I guess let's see. We don't have any questions online, so we'll open up for questions here.
Mine's a comment. Scott Lantman speaking for those on the phone from AID. My comment is I read that evaluation by Kathy McKeaton. I was really interested. I love Kathy, and I helped with the safeguards or the practice standards. So I was really curious as to how that tool was working in this regard. And my comment is, and this is no way trying to degrade the effort or speak badly of BioFund, but when I was reading the document, it seemed like there were a lot of yellow flags. Does that interpret well? Yellow flags. And yet when the final score was 83 out of 85, the math didn't add up to me, and I had to scratch my head to say, that's an awfully good report card, given that there were all these issues identified in the actual report. So I'm curious as to whether, and I saw a lot of praise come your way on email, so congratulations on that. I'm sure it's a fantastic effort. But am I wrong in my interpretation of that report? There was there were an awful large number of issues that still need to be addressed, I think. Is that the case?
Well, I think that Kathy, what she tried to do was really to raise our attention to areas where we could improve. We have to take into consideration that BioFund is not that long. And I think that the evaluation was very much focused on looking at the standards and considering the kind of environment where we are working and operating, how much did we evolve? And from that point of view, I really think that what was achieved is impressive. So I think that the spirit of the evaluation was that one. I don't think that there were, with the exception of the 3 issues that Sean indicated, that there were really issues of concern, because she's very methodic and detailed. You know, everybody that knows Kathy knows that. She tried to tell us, you can always do better in this aspect or that aspect, but she herself, and she saw the evolution of BioFund. She was very much involved with us in the beginning in the design of the bylaws and making sure that we had all the requirements that will be looked at positively by the funding entities, so to facilitate obviously our life in the future. So she herself was impressed on how much we achieved in that short period of time. So I think that the evaluation has to be seen. And from the point of view that, in fact, there were no serious issues. She's always trying to push us more and more. So that's how we looked at the report. And, you know, because obviously we had long debates with her about the results. So I don't think there are really issues of concern there, with the exception of these three that she said here, you really need to do something about it.
Well, the fact that you have so many donors, I think, speaks to how well you're doing and the validity of the evaluation. So I wasn't trying to
No.
speak poorly of that. I was struck when I read it on the.
Can I make a comment on your comment?
Sure.
Which is, I do agree with your assessment of Kathy. She's not here, so we can still talk about it. But
She might be.
Anyway, I will say that I have a similar personality in some respects, and so what I would say is we did an evaluation for another fund in Africa for different purposes, actually, to select them for a future project. And then we also did a capacity assessment for a fund relative to a future project. And I would completely agree with your assessment, which is that oftentimes what happens is you find concerns, but that you go check because actually it's fine. It's just that it's not perfect. And so to me, one of the great merits of this tool is the fact that it helps you to identify areas of improvement while giving board members and donors assurance that you're doing well enough. It's just always you can do better. And so to me, that adaptive kind of learning approach is really helpful. So that's at least my take on it.
Because it allows you the beauty of this instrument is that it allows you to look in detail with lots of little, okay, how about this? How about this aspect? How about that? And there's sort of 10 little aspects or 12 in each of those thematic areas that are looked at in detail. And it gives you a chance to step back from your day-to-day, you know, running around doing stuff, to actually have that strategic overview. You say, okay, this is a little bit less than, or here's some suggestions on how to make this better. Here's some suggestions on how to make that better. And gives us as staff very useful and very specific guidance. So we're quite happy with having stuff brought to our attention as this could be a bit better this way. Why don't you add an extra annex to your operational manual on this? Maybe you should also have a register of an added register on everyone's other business interests and do that every year rather than just once when people come in and so on. No, that kind of stuff. Better practices rather than just sort of this is the minimum you need to do and then don't worry about anything else.
So building on that, Tia Skinner with the CARE WWF Alliance and have been engaged with Primeiras and Segundas, which is one of the protected areas that you all fund. But I'm interested in sort of digging a little more on this question of what are the instruments, what are they useful for, how do we use them for reflection and adaptation, adaptive management. And so you mentioned, Sean, that, you know, the internal assessment tool has raised external flags, but I wanted to ask you about the role internally of that assessment tool. First of all, how it's different from this external tool that you've been using, and secondly, is there still value in this, you know, internal reflection that you've been doing? How are they complementary?
The internal tool was developed in 2014 when one of the World Bank projects a few iterations ago was being developed. And it was based on the Nature Conservancy's assessment tool for environmental organizations. And I can't remember its proper name, but Nature Conservancy Institutional Assessment Tool.
Mhm.
And it's kind of like a MET for institutions. And so it's a self-evaluation.
Right.
It covers 8 different categories, from financial to administration to human resource to communications and so on. And it's filled in once a year with the team internally looking at it and thinking about where you are in each of these different areas.
Mhm.
And one was developed for BioFund and one was developed for the Protected Area Agency in Mozambique. And they were slightly different because obviously those 2 agencies have different roles. So we find that a useful thing because it's done on an annual basis and it gives us a chance to look. Very interestingly, we recently had a USAID program and AID had a institutional assessment tool that we were all obliged to do, which I think ended up being 1% tool different from the institutional assessment tool we were doing internally. So we sort of gave a validation to that tool, and we think it's useful. But I think it's also very useful to have these external evaluations as well, where someone else came in and evaluated us. It wasn't a self-evaluation.
Well, and if I understand correctly, you're saying the CFA tool is specifically for, trust funds, exactly. And so that would be another distinction, right?
And I think one of the things I will talk to the evaluators this week about is I'll give them the institutional tool that we are using, and if it is at all useful for them as kind of a checklist that might be an additional input to what they do.
Let me read a question from online, because this was something that interested me too. This comes from Kina Murphy. How does BioFund interact with its member institutions? I would add, and individuals, its members. Are they also beneficiaries of both grants and capacity building, training? Do they bring on the ground needs and issues that BioFund should focus on? So what's the relationship between you and the members?
And the members of BioFund. It's a very, very tricky one because Kathy introduced it while working with us. I mean, in the early stages of the creation of BioFund, warned us a lot about the issue of conflict of interest. Sean informed you that we have members, and those members are, well, everybody who has an interest in conservation in Mozambique is a member of BioFund. So all our partners, all our beneficiaries, all the implementing institutions that we hire to, well, they're members of BioFund. So we have this problem with us. But anyway, without entering into corruption, we try really to observe, I mean, some distance, and sometimes members will have to recuse themselves when we discuss certain issues. But now, apart from this, we have started quite recently our set of communication, something that we were really lacking very much, so that, I mean, the flow of information with our membership is going to be improved. But apart from that, whenever we have big gatherings like our General Assembly, that's the moment where everybody has, apart from the ordinary things of elections, business of a General Assembly, we spend a lot of time to discuss among ourselves, I mean, in which manner can we improve our operations. We are informed about things that within the wider community of conservation in Mozambique, what is important to pay attention to, in which manner can we impress upon the government the need to do this and that. And so this is the moment where we discuss among ourselves. And in the intervals, I mean, whenever there is something of importance, I mean, we engage in meetings with a group of members. This is very intense because really everybody feels that BioFund his or her own thing. I mean, everybody is very much engaged. And we have a board. I mean, perhaps we should have included this in the role of our board. I mean, in the conduct of our business is really relevant to mention that our board is very, very, very committed. Of course, this is, I mean, they work for bono, but still, I mean, they're really very much engaged. I mean, they follow all aspects of our activities. Anabela is here, is one of them. And really, they scrutinize, I mean, what we do to make sure that there is no, no possibility of having problems with the government. And so, in fact, this is perhaps one of our main assets. I mean, the good relationship, I mean, between the board and the executive, and with the members and the members themselves. But still, we think that we need to have, for instance, newsletters and other forms, I mean, that would sort of help, I mean, the transit of information with our membership. The virtual library that has been created this year is proving to be one of the instruments that we can perhaps use more often and encourage people to assess. But, and the fact that we do not operate only in Maputo. Every year we have this big exhibition about biodiversity, and in one of the provincial capitals, and it is a big event. The entire provincial government is there, and in fact this year we had the head of state, I mean, the opening this exhibition in one of the provinces. It coincided with other activities. He was around, and so he came to open this event. So everybody was there, and it was really very interesting in the sense that we discussed a very serious problem of the pollution of rivers and lakes caused by illegal mining, mercury, and it's a very, very serious health problem. It's not the first time that this is mentioned, but the fact that this was discussed in an event started by BioFund, we feel that this is going to reach, I mean, the government and the ministries, and in fact we have already, some reaction, and we show that the problem eventually is going to be solved this time. So this is perhaps it answers to you.
Just, I would like to add the following. It's important to understand that when BioFund was established, our legal framework still is very narrow. It's not possible for it, for example, to create trust funds in Mozambique. So the foundation, it was created as a foundation, but the foundations mimic the structure that legally is imposed to associations. So there is a general assembly, then there is a board, and that's how it began. In a way, to have a general assembly can be problematic, but to avoid certain problems, it's really critical how we do the bylaws and where we put the powers of decision. And that gradually, even with the review and improvement of the bylaws, is being put more and more in the hands of the board. So at the end, the General Assembly works as a moment where BioFund gets some kind, first of all, provides some reporting on what's doing, so it's accountable for what's happening, because most of the representatives of the conservation community are there. It helps to validate certain decisions that are presented. They were already taken, so they're moving, but there is some validation coming out of this constituency. And this General Assembly is becoming interesting because what BioFund has done is that we usually select a team. So there is an event immediately following the General Assembly that is focused on that team. And there are people invited to come and do a presentation or a couple of presentations on that particular team. So it works as a moment, it ends up being also a stage of opportunity to a number of individuals that are knowledgeable, who did some research, have some report to present on a certain team, to do that for the entire community. So this helps to boost, in such a short period of time where there hasn't been yet so much time to provide on the core business of BioFund, which is to channel funds for conservation areas. I mean, it's not yet a very significant amount, let's say, compared to the needs, but this ends up building trust and confidence on BioFund. And it has worked really in that direction. So it has worked really well for BioFund.
Excellent. Barry, thank you.
So I'd like to find out more about what BioFund is doing in biodiversity offsets, because you said that it's a major focus now. And I know that in many other places, like maybe there have been discussions and studies for 5 years or something, but no actual payments being made. There's really very few examples in the world that I know of where there's actually payments flowing, as opposed to like doing studies and having a lot of meetings and so on. So I was wondering, maybe you're still at a very early stage in Mozambique with some of these biodiversity offsets, but I'd just like to find out what you're doing, because I don't know anything about biodiversity offsets in Mozambique.
Okay. I will try to be brief on this,
okay.
Because
I
can do this for hours, so I won't. Where are we? As I said, there was a roadmap written in 2016.
Yeah.
Previous to that, it was identified as a potential issue or a potential source of additional funding for conservation way back in 2010, when Melissa and I wrote a feasibility study on conservation finance for Mozambique. And then it was followed up with a little bit of this work, and then the World Bank took over and had a roadmap made. Then we had a great deal of assistance come in from WCS and their Combo project, which is working in 4 different countries in Africa, Mozambique being one of them, to help really set the legislation. Because you need to get offsets, you need a number of pieces of the puzzle in place. And you can really go down 2 routes. It's a little bit like carbon in some ways, is you have a voluntary route and you have a compulsory route. And during the production of the roadmap, it was clear from most of the major stakeholders, they preferred to go down a regulatory route and make it compulsory for everyone. As a result, you then have to have a legal framework that works. You have to have ways of making decisions on what kind of impacts, how are they quantified, who then registers it, who emits compliance certificates, making sure they have the capacity to actually do that work, and there's consensus about how it should all be done. So we've been working on a lot of those issues. Right now, we've just hired a lawyer to help the ministry write the final decree on it with all those pieces in place. We've hired and done a couple of studies on metrics, on how to do measurement of quality of biodiversity, how to sort of simplify that and make it applicable within the context of Mozambique and the capacity constraints that Mozambique has and data constraints that Mozambique has. And we have designed how all these different things should work. And we have sort of a 130-page document on how all this should actually work in little guidelines for people. Practically, we've had a lot of stakeholder engagement. We have all the major gas companies are talking to us. We have a forum that we meet periodically, which has the academic, private sector, government, NGOs, all sitting around the same table discussing these kind of nitty-gritty issues. And we've done training for hundreds of people around the country on offsets and what it is and how they should actually function. So right at this point, there is no company that is already financing an offset. They are scoping for offset sites and are doing the screening together with the recommendations and following the recommendations we've made and the guidelines that are in place, but they aren't yet actually doing the on-the-ground conservation yet, which is why BioFund has sourced some funding to do some pilots, which is within Mozambique, we've suggested that obviously development takes place in the whole country, but the offsets or the improvement of biodiversity should take place in the protected area network. This is controversial in other countries, but in Mozambique, which has a huge number of mostly paper parks, it's not terribly hard to make the case that there is definite additionality to it. So we're going to do some pilot work of actually doing restoration in 2 separate protected areas that will then be producing biodiversity gains that can be transferred to the private sector. So we're starting to do that now. We have a team starting to do an assessment of what exactly are they going to do in terms of reducing degradation in one of our protected areas. So we're working on that right now.
Thank you very much.
And that includes marine. Is it focused on marine or it includes marine? So both marine and terrestrial?
Both marine and terrestrial. We're starting with terrestrial, most of the terrestrial work, yeah, because it's easier to see. It's a better demonstration landscape. The demonstration landscape we're choosing actually is only an hour from Maputo, so we can bring the regulators there on a regular basis and show them what's happening, and so they can be part of that process.
Fascinating. We could spend all afternoon.
Hi, Kelly Elward. I'm the Washington Director for the Wildlife Conservation Society. Thank you for your presentation. Very informative. Mozambique can be complicated, complex. I'm interested specifically in, as a donor, finance, how do you enforce safeguards, both social and environmental safeguards on those that are recipients of support?
Do you want to talk about okay, safeguards is an area that we have, when people apply for funding, they fill in a little bit of information. At the moment, what we're funding in the protected areas is principally non-salary operating costs of the protected areas. We have, we've looked at that from a safeguard. We've had the World Bank come in and look at it from a safeguards perspective. Because we're receiving World Bank funding, they're looking at how much do our safeguards, really what you're doing, how much of it does it need a specific safeguard screening? And so they did a pre-screening of it, and they came and they said, really what you're doing right now doesn't require us to do any more detailed safeguard screening. We don't have an instrument of our own yet. It is a weakness. It's one of the things that, one of the reasons I put it up there on the screen was we're feeling we need to have more instruments of our own and not just use the other people, some of our donors' instruments that come to us. And it's somewhere we need to work on. So we actually had this discussion yesterday with some of the safeguards people in WWF who have been putting together the new safeguards policy here to see what lessons we can learn for us as an institution. So we're happy to take from other organizations and use the tools they have, but we do need to adapt them to our reality. And so that's another key piece that needs to be put into our operating procedures.
And then just to clarify, so currently it's just you in your relationship with your donors, but you are contemplating having tools that would apply to your
to all our
donor
beneficiaries.
as to you.
Exactly.
And then does AID, Scott, do you have particular safeguard policies for like TFCA, different nature swaps that you incorporate or include?
The answer is no to that. I mean, EID and their own expenditure funds usually use a NEPA like Reg 216, consider that their safeguard. But at the same time, I'm on the Multilateral Development Bank team, and so I actually go out and review bank projects and environmental social safeguards. Just did one on offsets in Costa Rica on a hydro project recently. So this is really interesting to me, and I'll be helping with a workshop Saturday on this issue as well in Mexico at the Red Line meeting. So that was a propaganda. The question was AID. I mean, AID at large, like I say, they use the NEPA-like methodology to comply with that, but there is greater thinking. When we're thinking about applying it in the CTF community, there's a whole system in WWF when they created their safeguards, because I went and talked with Brent yesterday as well, or the day before. You don't just have a list of nice safeguards, then you have a whole compliance, grievance mechanisms, and oversight, and there's a whole system that costs a lot of money to put in place to make these things work. So the whole discussion within the CTF community is trying to, I don't want to say dummy it up, but simplify it so that you can, it becomes manageable and affordable to be able to do. I hope that answers in part of your question. So.
In some ways, the regs, the 216, that's like in NEPA, so it's more environmental safeguards. Is there something similar for social safeguards, or that's incorporated?
It's both.
Oh, it is.
It is both. Yeah. With the way IND does it is kind of NEPA light relative to what the domestic agencies do, but we still have a process.
Okay.
Okay. Well, there was one more question, quite a broad one from online. This is from Libby Kamalu. So she's saying, thank you for your presentation and congratulations on launching a successful fund. Will you please tell us a bit about the steps that were taken to create the fund in 2011? I direct the question to Melissa, but I believe, yeah, so maybe you could just say a few words about the creation. I know it's...
Well, I was a founding member, so in my days when I was not yet in WWF, and I've been with WWF for 6 years and a half, so it took us, it was a long process, really. I mean, it began with a conference in 2007. The conference was focused on sustainable finance for conservation areas and was intended to convince the government that the next step we need to give is exactly to establish a fund, because, you know, it's not viable if we continue to expect that the government budget is going to fund conservation areas. Fortunately, it was successful, and WWF at the time, Sean was there, was indicated as the entity that would host the process of pushing and moving this forward until the day when we would be able to establish a fund. So with some funding that we got initially, so when I came in, it was funding from Jeff, but there was a bit of funding before from the French and WWF. So WWF began to move the process. We used the experiences from other funds that had been created, because WWF was promoting that in other African countries. During the conference, we called the Madagascar Fund. And that was really very convincing. It was a very interesting presentation. So we began, and then a consultant was hired to begin to work on the design of the fund itself. What is it that we want for Mozambique? There was this group of 7 founders that were voted by the conservation community to promote this thing, to be the establishers of the initiative. So gradually, it went on enlarging this initial team so that we would secure the different kinds of diversity of expertise. We brought on board 2 or 3 people, in fact, that were very critical. Our president of the board, because he was the former Minister of Finance. We knew that we needed to open certain doors in the government to get approval of things, and obviously because of his financial skills. We brought on board a former minister of various ministries, who is a lawyer by profession, again, because we needed his legal expertise and capacity to negotiate, again, with the government. We brought Luis. So up to the moment when in 2011, the bylaws were, because this has to be approved by the Council of Ministers, this is a complicated thing. It has to go to the Council of Ministers. It was approved in the Council of Ministers, so we began in 2007 to get it approved in 2011. And then it took us 1 more year to get the public of interest qualification, because otherwise it would have been extremely difficult to get funding from outside, and it's not automatic. Okay, so, and then until 2014, WWF was still there, managing the funds and paying the salaries of the very initial team, which was 2 or 3 people. And in 2014, finally, BioFund managed to begin to walk on their own legs. Now we are at the stage where we are trying to bring on board youngsters, so youth, and more people with financial skills, so that our investment committee works better. But yeah, it took a long period of time.
My suggestion, if that's because you're interested in creating a conservation fund, there are really 3 main lessons. One is it will take a lot longer than you think. The second, though, is to get the right people involved right at the beginning. So spend a lot of time, spend the time you need to get the right initial team together. Because if you start off on the wrong foot, you'll end up on the wrong foot no matter how long you spend, dithering about. And the third thing would be use the practice standards, because really a lot of that stuff of how to structure yourself, how to organize yourself, how to prepare yourself is now there. And it didn't exist when we were setting it up. And so we had to gather really these recommendations and these state-of-the-art standards from the various funds, picking up their statutes, sucking Melissa's memory and contact lists as much as possible to try to get those pieces of information together. But now you have a body of work that can help guide you. So those would be my recommendations: is study those practice standards first and then get your people together, but be patient.
There is a 4th point that I would add, Sean. BioFund was in a way very lucky, because BioFund began to participate in the cafe and in the REDLAC immediately. And out of that, we got some support from FONBIO. FONBIO has 20 years of existence, and it was extremely helpful. The year and a half or almost 2 years, then they got engaged and helped us to put all the systems in place for the organization to work properly. So it took a long time, but on the other hand, there were some happy coincidences that really helped it to move on with some success.
Well, I think on that note, we'll close the formal presentation, and maybe if you have a bit more time, people have other questions, we can have discussion informally. And I want to thank WWF again for hosting, and I want to thank you all for sharing your story and information, and wish you best of luck at REDLAC next week, and then in all your future endeavors. So thank you.
There's a little bit of information about BioFund there in the back corner if you want to take some of our. Not much left of it there. Oh.
Anabela. I wanted to quickly introduce you to my colleague Shauna Hatchen, who will tell you what she's doing in Mozambique, but I thought